Welcome, fellow castigators. This weekend I had the pleasure of watching Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, Tim Burton's first film since Dumbo in 2019. Apparently, his experience with Disney put him off filmmaking for a while.
Hail as old as time.
But he's back, and that's all that matters. Doing a sequel, which is rare for him. This time around, they use the character is now a cheap television show host trope to show that Lydia now has her own night vision ghost hunting show. There's really no point to this, and it isn't particularly funny. Lydia's new boyfriend Rory produces the show, and Lydia's daughter Astrid hates them for it because Lydia doesn't spend enough time with her. Also moving the plot is, of course, Beetlejuice, who is being pursued by his ex-wife Dolores, who either wants to marry him or kill him. They weren't particularly clear on that. Some of these characters work better than others. Beetlejuice himself is smashing, of course, although he doesn't really start to do anything interesting until he's summoned much later in the film. It feels kind of weird to meet Beetlejuice at a desk doing nothing. I would have hoped for a more exciting introduction. Regardless, Michael Keaton is just as funny as ever. Lydia Dietz makes for kind of an odd protagonist because she doesn't really say or do anything that makes the character feel like Lydia in the first one. I know she's older now, but for some reason there's just nothing interesting about Lydia this time around. I felt like I was just watching the mom from Stranger Things with weird hair. I'm also not pleased with how little the Maitlands are mentioned. They were practically her second set of parents, and she only talks about them once in the whole movie. It also feels pointless that they were so instrumental in her education just for her to sit in front of a studio audience and be incredibly lame. That being said, Winona Ryder's performance isn't bad at all. It just never quite feels like Lydia. In contrast, Catherine O'Hara comes back in full force as Delia Dietz, who is still properly wacky and running her own art studio now. She doesn't have a lot to do with the plot other than mourning the death of Charles, an event that does drive the plot. But the film would be significantly less funny without her. At my showing of the film, O'Hara got 80% of the laughs. Speaking of Charles, though, the film doesn't make the modern mistake of infusing character and actor, so thankfully the character of Charles is treated respectfully. Sure, he gets eaten by a shark, but all the characters refer to him as the nice, normal guy that he was. Anyway, next up is Lydia's daughter, Astrid, who is a sullen feminist who's obsessed with climate change. Jenna Ortega is great, as always. But Astrid isn't as nearly likable or interesting as Lydia was. She isn't written too differently from Wednesday Addams, wasting most of her time with some cringy YA nonsense that includes a dorky teen who reads Dostoevsky. People who gad on about the weather and socialism are just not interesting. And it feels like Wednesday writers Alfred Goh and Miles Miller just can't help themselves but let all the kids know just how hip and cool they are. The harsh truth is that although the terminally online will cream themselves over Astrid's ideals, the majority audience will not be able to relate with her on the same level as Lydia, who was more of a generalized goth type. A worse crime than Astrid, though, is Lydia's boyfriend Rory, who is mostly useless to the plot, but takes up an excruciating amount of screen time. It feels like the writers thought Rory was really funny, but no one else did. Justin Theroux is a decent actor, but Rory is about as captivating as a wet blanket, and his scenes seem to drone on and on forever. I feel like they should have seriously cut down the scenes with both boyfriends so they could make room to flesh out characters like Beetlejuice's ex-wife Dolores, who has very few lines and does essentially the same thing in every scene. It's disappointing because Monica Bellucci is a great actress, but she essentially just chases Beetlejuice around the netherworld, sucking souls with a very funny practical effect, and then upon finding him, is done away with almost immediately. It feels like a waste of actress and a waste of character potential. As for the rest of the characters, there are bit parts played by Willem Dafoe, Bern Gorman, and Danny DeVito, who are all excellently funny and make their screen time worthwhile. Story-wise, the plot is just kind of okay. It spends a lot of time retreading old ground, including the ending, which is not really what you want in a sequel. It's good to address things from the original, like continuity with the house, the netherworld, and the old characters, but you also have to introduce new concepts that make the story worth telling. While plenty entertaining, this story doesn't really add anything new, and largely takes jokes from the original and makes them bigger and louder, like taking the shrunken head guy and making a small army of them. It's charming, but it's not exactly the comedic originality of the first one. I was really hoping to see Beetlejuice come up with a brand new scheme that drives the plot, but instead he's mostly used as a tool, frequently taking characters who are actually doing things from point A to point B. The movie isn't really about anyone, and every character ends up feeling like a footnote in no one's story. I understand why they couldn't bring back the Maitlands, but the lack of central characters going through actual development is truly felt.
Listen, I gave...
That being said, the story is beautifully rendered through physical sets and mostly practical effects. It's the first Tim Burton film to feel superbly Tim Burton since The Corpse Bride almost 20 years ago. I hope this encourages Burton to go back to being sufficiently weird, and I hope it causes the studio to realize that you can make movies set in a wild fantasy world without breaking the bank on copious and unnecessary amounts of CGI. Despite being a classically made film, however, it does sport a few minor modern touches, such as straightforward and dull shot composition, overly realistic lighting, characters who are activists instead of legitimate people, and way too many pre-existing songs. Some of these pop songs are used for comedic effect, but many of them are there for no reason, and as a result, Danny Elfman's score is very rarely heard at all. Although this is very much a return to form for Tim Burton, it is by no means full-on Tim Burton. This film almost plays as a transition from the Tim Burton that he became by going to mainstream back to the Tim Burton that he was. Unfortunately, he is still holding on to some of the awful modern sensibilities that detract from his uniqueness as a filmmaker. But if this is the transitory period he needed to get back on track, then it will all have been worth it. That being said, I think that Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is a highly entertaining film. There is a lot about it that works, and I really enjoyed watching it. As long as you're ready to see the writer's self-hatred projected onto all the male characters, then I actually recommend you go see Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. I appreciate it for what it is, and I hope that you will too. Thanks for listening.
Oh, hey, who dares criticize Jenna Ortega? Is this guy some kind of incel? Someone should dox this guy, show him who's boss. I bet I could get a woke Redditor to do that. I'm feeling a little, anxious, if you know what I mean. It's been about 600 years after all. I wonder where a guy, an everyday Joe like myself, can get a little action.